Welcome to the Wade Center's podcast.
A podcast of Wheaton College.
So there's this story he falls in love with, and it becomes the story he keeps telling over and over and over again, the journey. Virtually all of his fiction is dealing in some way with this kind of story that he loves. In essence, Lewis really only wrote one book, and everything else he did is a commentary based on that.
Hi, this is Crystal Downing, and David and I are here with Dr. Hal Poe, the Charles Colson Professor of Faith and Culture at Union University in Jackson, Tennessee. Thanks for joining us today, Hal.
Thank you.
I was really impressed when I saw your resume, and you have 17 books. The ones that are of most interest to us here at the Wade, of course, are about the authors we have archived. And I would like you to tell us first about your book called The Inklings of Oxford. What was your purpose and thesis in that book?
That book was an accidental book that I'd been hoping someone would do.
Oh.
And no one would do it. And so I finally said, well, goodness, let's just go on and do it. It's a coffee table book. It makes no pretense to being a scholarly work. What I wanted to do was introduce the broad public to C.S. Lewis and his literary friends. I did it to pique the interest of the average person who might have seen some of the Tolkien movies or the Lewis movies and gotten an interest in who these people were. Mm-hmm. It has lavish photography by my colleague at Union, who went with me for 10 days to take the pictures of Oxford. So it's a beautiful invitation to the city that was the context in which they did all of their work. And it's the sort of thing that setting makes a difference. And the city of Oxford is just such a glorious place to spur the imagination. So Jim Veneman's photography is just dazzling. And I do a narrative about the friendship of those people. And the book is about friendship.
Yeah, nice.
I reviewed that book, actually. And I congratulated you at cslewis.com. They have a blog. And I congratulated you on being willing to write the text for a book that has so much beautiful photography. Because in some ways, the pictures are so stunning that you wonder if people will sit down and read the text.
Oh, I don't know that anyone would read the text when you've got all of those beautiful pictures.
Well, I made a mistake in my review. You said something about the Inklings are a little bit themselves like the Hobbits. And I said something like, well, that's stretching it a bit in my review. And then I ran across a letter of Tolkien's where he says, oh, yeah, I'm essentially a hobbit in everything but size. So do you want me to write a retraction or anything?
No, you're kind to even point it out.
But I did say how well written it was in terms of, because there's a lot of different stories. There's different intertwining individuals. And I thought you did a beautiful job of giving a general overview without overemphasizing one over the others. And it was
well, thank you. Thank you.
Highly recommend
it was
that
fun
book
to do.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
You also published a book called C.S. Lewis Remembered, which is a collection of reflections by former students of Lewis. That must have been really fun to write.
It was fun to do because the people who contributed to it were still living at that time. A number of them have died since then, just over the last 15 years. But what prompted the book, we know of Lewis's huge influence as a Christian writer of apologetics, but that wasn't what he did for a living. For a living, he was an English teacher at a college, and I wondered, well, at a time when so many Christian colleges in the United States were concerned with how do you teach from a Christian perspective, I wondered what influence did he actually have on the Guild, on higher education. And so I started tracking down his former students, and he had an enormous impact. His students went on to become heads of colleges and to hold the prestigious professorships here on this side of the Atlantic. Brown Patterson, who contributed one of the chapters, was a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford in the early 50s, and he spent his 2 years reading English literature with Lewis before he went back to Harvard to do a PhD in history, and became the dean at the University of the South in Sewanee, which is a significant liberal arts school in the South. So people like that, Derek Brewer, who went to supper with Lewis and Hugo Dyson a night or so after the famous Anscombe debate, went on to be head of a college in Cambridge and an eminent literary scholar. And so on and on, one after another. They had huge careers, Lewis's students. And they had fascinating things to say about what was it like to know Lewis as a student. None of them claimed to be friends, but and Jim Como's book has that collection of essays, The Friends of Lewis. But this was a different perspective.
One of them had an oral exam, the Vivas. I think it was Lewis, Tolkien, Hugo Dyson, and Helen Gardner, who was a formidable intellect in her own right. That'd be a rather daunting group to go up in front of for your examinations.
Oh, my goodness. And, Helen Gardner wrote a short biography of Lewis when he died.
Right.
And would have been, I suppose, one of the very first. It would have been an article-length biography, not a book. But she had a great respect and admiration for him. But she was quite a formidable scholar herself.
This book of reminiscences, they're always interesting to get the first-hand reminiscences. Another one sent Lewis a transcript of the dream he had. He wanted Lewis to be his Daniel and say, what do you think this dream meant? And Lewis wrote back and gave his interpretation of what he thought was a spiritually inspiring dream and that the young man should pursue the direction that the dream was leading. But how many famous professors would... if a student says, can you read this transcript of my dream? I think it's, he's retired and moved to Mexico, so I'm sorry. He was amazingly obliging to these people in terms of keeping in touch with letters and interviews.
He was. I'm amazed that he managed to carry on the correspondence that he did and produce the work that he did. It's staggering.
I know some students resented Lewis a bit. Did you run into any of that antagonistic response when you were collecting these reminiscences?
No, I suppose those weren't the ones that I found. So I know there were those. The poet laureate of England was one of those who didn't care for Lewis Benjamin.
Yeah.
But Lewis didn't care for him either.
Yeah.
He was lazy and shiftless and just barely getting by. But
he'd show up for tutorials in his bedroom slippers and that kind of thing.
Yeah. Well, why don't you tell us about your current project? You are doing research here at the Wade Archives.
Yes, it's it's a book I had not planned to do, had not thought of doing, and it had an odd beginning. Lewis loved to eat. He talked about how much he loved to eat, loved food, but I didn't know what he liked to eat. And this was just a casual Saturday afternoon pondering, well, I wonder what Lewis liked to eat. If I were going to put together a cookbook of C.S. Lewis's favorite dishes, what on earth would be in the cookbook? And I thought, well, I'll flip through the letters and see if he ever mentions any particular things he liked, because I couldn't remember him talking about anything in particular in any of his books. And as I started at the beginning, as a little boy, Lewis talked about having had a meal, but it's not until we get to his first morning living with the Kirkpatricks when he was 16 years old in 1914 in Great Bookham, that he thrills to the discovery that Mrs. Kirkpatrick has made good old Irish soda bread for breakfast. And so as I read along through his adolescence, just looking for food, what I discovered, to my amazement, was how many of his preferences, the things he liked, the things he didn't like, were formed during his teenage years. And these were the things that became the rails on which his conversion took place, and they became the basis for his entire career as an adult. And so that was the genesis of the idea. Oh my goodness, we really haven't paid much attention to his youth, even though Surprised by Joy is primarily a story of his youth. Biographers have tended to dismiss that part to get on to the important things, and have wondered, why did he spend so much time talking about his miseries and as a teenager? This doesn't have anything to do with anything. But I think, and this is the point of the book, Becoming C.S. Lewis, a biography of the young Jack Lewis. So it begins with the death of Lewis's mother, when, without trial of jury and contrary to Magna Carta, he's shipped off to concentration camp. And that's what he calls it in Surprised by Joy, concentration camp. So it begins with the death of his mother and ends with the end of World War I. And so that period from the end of boyhood through the end of adolescence as he becomes a young man. Now, it ends without him being a Christian, but the stage is set, and I don't suppose it's right to say his conversion was inevitable, but the track on which his conversion played out was set by the end of World War I.
I love that you call it Becoming Mr. Lewis, becoming
C.S. Lewis, becoming
because
C.S. Lewis.
of the recent novel called Becoming Mrs. Lewis about John Davidman.
And we had settled on the title before that book was published, so I thought, oh my goodness, it is going to sound a little derivative, I suppose, or imitative, but...
Well, if you stayed with food, you could call it Surprised by Jam. Could that be it?
Thank you, David.
So right now, then, are you working on the post 1914?
All right. So we've come through his teenage years, and I thought, oh my goodness, I hate that we've left off here when the stage is just set for the next phase. So I proposed to Crossway, who is the publisher, the possibility of a follow-up book. The Making of C.S. Lewis, From Atheist to Apologist, 1918 to 1945. And fortunately, they liked the first book so much, they thought, well, we'll give him a shot at the second one. So I'm now doing research for that second book, where everything plays out, and essentially to show that the relationship between his teenage years and the establishment of his career, and the foundation on which he was able to become a Christian apologist almost immediately after his conversion, which is an unusual thing. So that's what the second book is going to explore.
It's almost as though he was so aware of his own intellectual process to faith that he could project all of the objections to Christianity since he had lived through them. It's very similar to the fact that people can't believe that Lewis could write these novels that appeal to children when he had no children. But it's because he remembered so well his own experience as a child.
He did, and when we think of the Chronicles of Narnia, and David, you've done the definitive work, so I talk about this sheepishly. He began the story with a memory. He had the memory of a picture in his mind of a fawn in the snow with an umbrella and brown paper packages, and he said he had that vision, that image in his mind when he was 16 years old. Well, when he was 16 years old, he was living with Mr. Kirkpatrick in Great Bookham, a wild part of Surrey, where he fell in love with snow. He adored the snowscapes, and he would go walk for miles in the snow. And that was where that first introduction to what became Narnia took place. And yes, he was remembering. And I would argue that the children evacuated during the war, though there were evacuees living at the kilns during World War II, they were essentially slave labor for Mrs. Moore. But at Kirkpatrick's house during World War I, Jack Lewis was free to roam about the countryside, and I think he's remembering what it was like to be just on the edge of no longer young enough. He's 16, and so he's reached that age where you can't go through the wardrobe anymore. But it was that last stage of childhood fantasy and imagination.
I had a guess. You said you're going to speak sheepishly. Does that mean my reply is wolfishly? I was wondering how far you could push that image that stuck in his mind as a teenager, because he was reading a lot of the classics with Kirkpatrick, and here it's a faun. If you look at his letters, he's saying, I just received this beautiful package, and it's this new book, and it's some European novel or some classic. And I think the brown packages may have been getting a book, The Life of the Intellect.
Oh, that makes sense.
And I would even go so far as the umbrella and the snow being his love of England and that part of England. I don't want to be too allegorical there, but it seems like every component of that image was the things he loved most deeply.
Well, and one thing that he discovered when he was living with Kirkpatrick was his love of a particular kind of story. Now, just before he went to Kirkpatrick, he'd spent the last couple of years falling in love with Norse mythology. And most of your listeners are familiar with that, his fascination with the same mythologies that would fascinate Tolkien. But the love of Norse mythology led him to William Morris, late 19th century English writer, and he did everything, designed wallpaper and tiles, but Morris wrote about versions of the Norse, and from there Lewis got to his stories about the well at the end of the world, and these stories of journey, the impossible journey where you risk all odds to attain that impossible goal at the end of the world and then come back again. And he had that story, and that led him to the King Arthur stories and the quest for the Grail and Le Morte d'Arthur, and then the Mallory's Death of Arthur then led him to Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, which led him to Spenser's The Faerie Queen. And he read these stories over and over and over and over and over, and they're the same plot. That it's this story he loves of this journey, and that's the point at which he found George MacDonald's Phantastes. And it's the same story, only they take on a deeper and deeper spiritual significance, almost in the order in which he reads them. So that the Faerie Queen is the greatest of the last of the medieval allegorical courtly love poems. And in the earliest, Chrétien de Troyes' story of Lancelot and Guinevere, where adultery is at the heart of courtly love, by the time you get to Spenser, well, it's just a few decades shy of Don Quixote, and where there is this respect and adoration of the great lady from afar and no thought of adultery. And it's that picture that Lewis carries into Perelandra. And so there's this story he falls in love with, and it becomes the story he keeps telling over and over and over again, the journey. And something happens on the journey. So when he writes his spiritual autobiography immediately after his conversion, it's an allegory. And the Pilgrim's Regress, where you go there and back again. And you go to Malacandra and back again. And every time you're changed. When you make the journey, you're changed. And you risk all for the great unattainable that is attained. And so you go to Perelandra and back again. And looking at it the other way around, you go from hell to heaven. And the sad ones that go back again. And you go into the wardrobe and back again. And so virtually all of his fiction is dealing in some way with this kind of story that he loves. And it's how he has a career, because in essence, well, I do suggest, I argue, that Lewis really only wrote one book, The Allegory of Love, and everything else he did is a commentary based on that. And that's not a downplaying of Lewis. That's the idea that he had one great literary love, and he milked it for all it was worth.
There's an old saying that every autobiography contains some fiction and all fiction contains some autobiography. That would probably fit with Lewis. It's interesting. You mentioned how they had sources like Morris and the Knights in Armor. He and Tolkien both loved Norse mythology and William Morris fantasies. But it's interesting to me that you just talked about There and Back Again, which sounds like Tolkien.
It does sound like Tolkien. I wonder what I'm suggesting.
Yeah,
I think what I'm suggesting is that the greatest influence Lewis had on Tolkien was to get Tolkien in two of his stories to shift from a Norse view of mythology to a more Christian view of mythology. Because in the Silmarillion, which Tolkien just never could quite finish, it's like a retelling of Beowulf. You go off and you die. It's a hopeless situation, which was the Norse, Valhalla, the twilight of the gods. They were all going to go up in flames, and it was a hopeless sort of a situation.
Yeah, I know. I have Swedish roots, and the dour atmosphere among my Swedish relatives just explains Norse mythology to me.
Yeah, things are bad, but they're bound to get worse.
Yes.
But here with Lewis, he'd fallen in love with this There and Back Again story, and that's what Tolkien uses in both The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, contrary to everything else he wrote in the Silmarillion. And so I think that's Lewis's greatest influence on Tolkien.
I'm teaching a class on Christianity and fantasy right now, and my students are talking about how Lewis always writes what are called portal fantasies, where you start out in a primary world, and then you go through a wardrobe or through a painting and end up in Narnia. Whereas Tolkien has what are called immersion fantasies, where you wake up in the secondary world or the imaginary world or the subcreation. And we were trying to parse why one of them wanted to literally go there and back again from Earth to the world of fairy or enchantment, whereas the other one just whisked you away and you start out on the first page. I didn't really have an answer for them, so I'm counting on you to answer that question for me.
Well, we'll have to do that the next podcast.
Okay. After your next book, we'll put that on there.
I guess they were different people, weren't they? They had points in common, but they really were different. I think that, to me, that's one of the things that stood out in terms of this first book, realizing that Lewis's first great friend, Arthur Greaves, had something in common with him, this love of Norse mythology, but they were so different in every other possible way as to how they acted, what they liked, the way they behaved. And I think you've got the same differences between Lewis and Tolkien. And
right, yeah. He said of Barfield, he read all the right books, but he got the wrong things out of them. Yeah. And sometimes one of Tolkien and Lewis felt that way about each other's fantasies. They had such a different take on their creative sources.
Yeah.
David was being interviewed on the radio for one of his C.S. Lewis books, and he said that if it hadn't have been for Tolkien, we probably would never have heard of Lewis, and if it hadn't have been for Lewis, we may never have heard of Tolkien. And the commentator said, yeah, and if we hadn't have heard of Lewis and Tolkien, we'd never have heard of you.
Yeah, that was uncalled for.
But I think you're onto something there, because that mutual encouragement, I think, was critical to both of them doing anything outside of their regular academic work.
Right.
they would have made their own splash in a very small pond. They both did. Lewis, I think, did more significant scholarly work. Tolkien's was so narrow that it's, working up a vocabulary and that sort of thing. But Allegory of Love, of course, is still in print. And if you're going to study medieval allegorical courtly love poetry, you have to deal with Lewis, even if to disagree with him. But beyond that, I think apart from their mutual encouragement, you're absolutely right. They probably never would have done anything outside of their scholarly work, because by the time Lewis becomes a Christian, he'd already given up his dreams of being a poet.
Mm-hmm.
And so
some of us are glad he did.
So what would he have done if he wasn't going to be a poet? I mean, I think that.
Well, talking about the influence of Lewis and Tolkien on each other, I understand that you have spent a lot of time thinking and teaching about the influence of Tolkien and Lewis on J.K. Rowling's Harry Potter series. What got you interested in that?
Well, I got interested in Rowling and Harry Potter when her first book came out, and I was horrified at the idea of at an age when the occult and Wicca were reappearing in the culture, that here was a story obviously designed to hoodwink young people into being interested in the occult. So I got the book so that I could expose it for what a dreadful thing it was, and to my shock, I realized halfway through, oh my goodness, this is a Christian book. The woman is a Christian, and she's telling a Christian story, and she's critiquing the occult, not advocating it. And it was unnerving. In the first book, she makes the case for the reasonableness of substitutionary death in a way similar to, and even the vocabulary she uses is taken from The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, this deeper magic that the enemy knew nothing of, didn't understand, couldn't comprehend. Love, this most powerful of magic. And then I realized what she was doing with the kind of magic she talked about. The magic she talks about is, in fact, the miracles of the Bible. And she uses words like transfiguration. Well, most of us have heard the sermon on transfiguration, in which the pastor never does explain what the word transfiguration means, and none of us ask because you don't want to admit you don't know. And so I was in seminary before I knew what transfiguration meant, but J.K. Rowling explains it early on for children. It's changing something from one thing to another. When Moses transfigured a staff into a serpent, and when Christ was transfigured on the mountain from his appearance as a man to his glorified state as King of Kings and Lord of Lords, and my goodness, weren't Peter, James, and John bedazzled by that experience? So she explains a lot of biblical terminology whose meaning has been lost. And so on and on she goes through the 7 books in the series until at the end she gives the best exposition of Romans 6 I know of in literature, and really of any theologian I've heard of. Most just don't really deal with Romans 6, the very idea of dying and rising with Christ, and that in the dying with him, our sin is destroyed, and thus we rise with him in his resurrection, free from sin. And that's essentially the climax to the whole series. After she'd finished publishing, there was a press conference when the last one came out, and as usual, there was a swarm of reporters to ask her questions. And once all the questions had been asked, she said, Now, there's a question that have been asked over and over. Do you believe in God? But no one ever asks the follow-up question. And so, do I believe in God? Yes, I do. And she waited. No one asked, what's the follow-up question? So finally she said, the follow-up question is, do you believe in Jesus? And the answer is yes, and all my books are about Christian doctrine. And so it's been a great series to teach a course on, because in fact you do hit all of the major doctrines and see, how do you talk about them in a fictional way without being didactic. And this is what Lewis called latent Christianity, when he said, for apologetics, we really don't need more little Christian books. We need more little books by Christians on every subject with the Christianity latent. And that's what Rowling has succeeded in doing, and I think done brilliantly.
If we have listeners who are looking for an idea for a dissertation or a book, I think The Legacy of Lewis and Tolkien in Our Own Generation would be a great book. Do Lee Finger's Peace Like a River, J.K. Rowling. Well, Madeline L'Engle's a little older. Peterson, the great novels coming out of the Peterson brothers, the stories. That'd be a good idea for a book, don't you think? Their ongoing living legacy.
Yes.
Maybe you should write
then
that.
they can come study at the Wade, and then we'll interview them at a podcast and make them famous.
Okay. Let's not promise too much here.
On top of being an amazing scholar, Hal, you also have administrative skills. You were vice president at Union for a while, but you also were the founder of the Inklings Fellowship, and you direct its annual Christianity in the Academy Conference in Montreat. What gave you the motivation to start the Inklings Fellowship, and how did you conceive of it as operating, and has it changed over the years?
The idea of fellowship and just getting together with folks to get away, it was really the motive. It was almost 20 years ago, and Don King, who I'm sure many of your listeners know Don's work on Lewis and Joy and Ruth Pitter, we started putting it on up in the mountains near Asheville in Montreat, a weekend getaway. The location is as important as what we do. We go away to the Misty Mountains, and there in Rivendell, I mean, locally they call it Montreat, but it's really Rivendell. And the importance of retreat. And I think we've almost lost that concept. We go away to conferences and, just are busy, or we go on vacations, but we very rarely go on retreats anymore. And so a time of refreshment and renewal. And we use the Inklings as a model of people who did this and would take time. They'd go off on these big walks. Let's walk 50 miles and pouring rain, but they knew how to do that. So that was the beginning of it, and we're concerned, since I'm a professor and Don is a professor. We were concerned with helping Christians in the academy think about their discipline from a perspective of faith. And what is unique about a Christian insight into discipline, just as there's a Marxist insight and there might be a Freudian insight, well, there's a Christian insight.
Right.
Yeah.
And so we have an academic conference every year, which is a conference with submitted papers and faculty members from all over the, mainly the South. We meet in Memphis, so between Texas and North Carolina down to Florida, from up to Kentucky. We'll gather in the winter and have a one-day conference. Then every third year we go to Oxford for a week, and we'll have a more expansive exploration of a theme. This summer we're going to be exploring the idea of friendship and the importance of friendship in the Christian life. So our model is that we do it ourselves, so there are no employees. We don't have much overhead. And so it's a sort of a break-even model of everybody pulling up their own bootstraps and pitching in and pulling it off.
That's
So
fantastic.
most of the retreats I've been to have been exhausted. And I'm looking for one that's just called surrender, where you just, it's not even a retreat, it's just a utter surrender. I wanted to ask also about a little bit more about your next book. I'm kind of coming full circle here.
Yes.
I just wanted a few words about what you see as the thesis or the thread, which is going to pull together the upcoming book.
Well, springing from the first book, his adolescence, one of the things that I think folks have been amazed by at Lewis's failure to get a teaching post when he finished his Oxford degree. He'd done classical philosophy and history and language, and he had a stellar career as a student, but he didn't get a job. And what do you do? He finally decided, well, I'll hang around one more year and do another degree. And it's not that he did another major, as we would in the United States, because in Oxford, all degrees are freestanding. There is no core curriculum. You do the entire degree. So how did he do a college degree at Oxford in only 1 year in English? How is it physically possible to read all that has to be read? Well, the reason he did it is because he'd read all the books for pleasure as a teenager. And he hadn't read them once. He'd read them 3 or 4 times. And so...
And usually in the original languages.
Yes. And so that period that he was most fascinated with, the medieval period for English literature, then became the basis for his college career and then for his academic career. And so his first big book, The Allegory of Love, essentially is a book that goes from the classical period, which he had already worked on, through the medieval period, during which, in order to understand the medieval literature, he had to master patristic theology, early Christian theology, and medieval theology, so that by the time he was a Christian, he already knew the information of Christianity. But now that he had faith in the content of Christianity, the God of the Bible, he was able to use all of that information and be an effective apologist. And he knew his own track by which he had come to faith, and that autobiographically became his first apologetic work, The Pilgrim's Regress. But in an odd way, the first broadcast talks that became Mere Christianity, Right and Wrong is a Clue to the Meaning of the Universe, are the steps he himself had experienced in coming out of materialism into theism. And it was with Kirkpatrick, he shared this belief, there's just the concrete world, what you can know with your senses, except he had these stories he loved that were full of courage and duty and honesty and a wide range of values that you can't touch, taste, hear, smell. And he had to concede, as he was leaving Great Bookham going off to the war, well, I guess there are these values that exist in addition to the physical universe. And once you've cracked that, once you've decided there is right and wrong, then you've got a clue to the meaning of the universe. It would take him, over a decade to work it on out. But in Right and Wrong is a Clue to the Meaning of the Universe, that first section of Mere Christianity, he gives us a thumbnail sketch of how you get from materialism to theism.
So once again, he's retracing his own journey as he lays out these instructions for other followers.
He's following the command of Christ, which is bear witness, tell your own story, give your testimony. And so he does that in different ways without talking about himself.
Right, right. Well, that's probably a good note to end on. I think that's probably an inspiring note for our listeners to think about how best to tell your story without making it about yourself.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, really enjoyed the conversation, Hal.